Can you imagine? The only man you gave birth to, raised, sacrificed your whole life to give him everything, locking you in an abandoned house without electricity, water, or food, and then driving off to Hawaii for a vacation? Not an enemy, not a stranger. It's your only son. That's what happened to Vivian Carter. At 66, she sat in the darkness of a lakeside cabin, her hands trembling, her mouth parched, and her heart broken beyond repair. This story will make you angry. It will make you cry. And finally, it will make you applaud. Please comment with the city you're watching from so I know how far my story has come. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the surprising ending. The door clicked shut behind him with a sound so ordinary it almost didn't register. A simple mechanical click. The kind of sound a door makes 1,000 times in a lifetime. When someone steps out to check the mail, when a teenager heads to school, when a husband leaves for work on a Monday morning. A sound that means nothing, except that this time it meant everything. I stood in the middle of the cabin and listened to his footsteps cross the porch. I listened to the boards creak under his weight, the same weight I had carried in my arms when he was 7 pounds and 4 ounces, and the most beautiful thing I had ever seen in my life. I listened to the gravel crunch beneath his shoes as he walked to his car. I listened to the engine turn over. That expensive engine in that expensive car I had helped him buy when he was 26 and just starting out and needed a vehicle that looked successful even before he was. I listened to all of it, and then I heard nothing. My name is Vivian Carter. I am 66 years old. I raised 1 child, buried 1 husband, and spent the better part of 4 decades believing that the greatest thing a mother could do was pour herself into her son until there was nothing left of her own life worth mentioning. I believed that sacrifice was love. I believed that giving was its own reward. I believed, with the kind of faith that doesn't need evidence because it lives in the bones, that blood was permanent. I was wrong about all of it. The cabin was dark. The power had been cut. I didn't know that yet, but I would find out when I crossed to the light switch near the kitchen doorway and clicked it up and down 4 times before accepting that nothing was going to happen. The windows were covered, not with curtains, but with something heavier, something that had been placed there deliberately to keep the afternoon light out. It took me a moment to understand that the coverings were pieces of plywood, nailed from the outside. Nailed from the outside. I remember the exact sensation that moved through my body when that understanding arrived. It wasn't panic, not right away. It was something quieter and more terrible than panic. It was the feeling of a floor dropping out from under a certainty you've held your entire life. The certainty that your child, whatever else has gone wrong between you, would never actually hurt you, would never cross the line from careless into cruel, would never look at the woman who made him possible and see an obstacle instead of a person. That feeling, that silent falling feeling, is something I had never experienced before, and I hope I never experience it again. I tried the door first. I turned the handle and pushed, and the door held. I turned it the other way and pulled, and the door held. I put my shoulder against it the way I'd seen people do in movies, and my shoulder hurt for a week afterward, and the door held. There was a deadbolt on the inside, but the mechanism had been tampered with, jammed, something I couldn't explain in the moment, but understood later when a locksmith told me what Ethan had done to make sure I couldn't operate it from within. My son had planned this. That was the thought that kept arriving and departing and arriving again, like a car circling a block it can't find a parking space on. My son had planned this. Not in a moment of rage, not in some impulsive explosion of frustration. He had planned this the way you plan a vacation, carefully, ahead of time, with attention to the details that would make it work. He'd chosen this cabin because it sat at the end of a dirt road, half a mile from the nearest paved surface, at the edge of a private lake that nobody visited between Labor Day and Memorial Day. It was late October. The only people who might wander past were hunters, and hunting season didn't open for another 2 weeks. He'd cut the power. He'd covered the windows. He'd disabled the deadbolt. And then he'd driven away to Hawaii with his wife, Naomi, who had been smiling at me over breakfast that morning with the warm, practiced smile of a woman who had already decided how this day was going to end. I need to tell you something about this cabin before I go any further, because the cabin matters in a way that goes beyond just being the place where I was trapped. 31 years ago, my husband Gerald and I bought this property with money we had been saving since before Ethan was born. Gerald found it on a Sunday drive in the spring, this little wooden cabin at the water's edge, half hidden by pine trees that were older than either of us. He called me over to look at it with the same expression he wore when he was trying not to show how excited he was about something. A kind of deliberate calm that never quite reached his eyes. "What do you think?" he said. "I think it's falling apart," I said. "Most good things are when you first find them," he said. We bought it for $42,000, which was almost everything we had. We spent the next 3 summers fixing it up ourselves, Gerald and I and a teenage Ethan, who complained about splinters and mosquitoes and drove us both half crazy with his sighing. We replaced the roof, we rebuilt the porch, we installed the plumbing that still worked, or had worked, until Ethan cut the water line at the main shutoff, which I also wouldn't discover until later. Gerald died in this cabin. Not dramatically. He simply went to sleep one September evening with the window open and the sound of the lake coming through, and he didn't wake up. The coroner said his heart had been quietly failing for months. I like to think he knew that, and he chose this place on purpose because it was the place where he had been most himself. I had kept the cabin all these years because letting it go felt like letting Gerald go, and I wasn't ready for that. Ethan had been after me for 2 years to sell it. He said it was impractical. He said the maintenance costs were ridiculous for a place I visited 4 or 5 times a year. He said the property values in the area were at a peak and it would be foolish to hold on to it. What he didn't say was what Naomi had told him, that the cabin and the land together were worth somewhere around $380,000, and that money would look a lot better in their investment portfolio than it did sitting on the edge of a lake where an old woman went to cry about her dead husband. I found that out later. I found out a great many things later. But standing in that dark cabin on that October afternoon, all I knew was that I was alone and I couldn't get out and my phone had no signal. I want to be honest with you about the next few hours, because there's a version of this story where I stayed calm and resourceful and handled everything with grace, and that version would be a lie. I did not stay calm. I sat down on the floor, not on the couch, not on one of the chairs, on the floor, because my legs stopped working properly, and the floor was what was available. I sat there with my back against the wall and my knees pulled up, and I cried in a way I hadn't cried since Gerald's funeral. Not pretty crying, the other kind. The kind that hurts your chest and leaves you feeling wrung out and hollow when it's over. I cried for a long time. When I stopped, it wasn't because I felt better. It was because I ran out of something. Energy, tears, the capacity to continue. I ran out, and the silence of the cabin filled back in around me, and I sat with it. The light coming around the edges of the plywood was starting to dim. 4 o'clock maybe. 5. In late October, the dark comes early, and I knew that whatever I was going to figure out, I needed to figure it out before the light was completely gone. I got up off the floor. My knees protested. My lower back, which had been giving me trouble since August, sent a sharp complaint up my spine that I ignored out of necessity. I stood there in the middle of the cabin and I made myself breathe slowly and think. What did I have? I had my purse, which Ethan had left with me, probably because taking it would have looked too obviously like what this was. Inside the purse, my wallet, a small notebook I'd been using to jot down grocery lists, a pen, a travel pack of tissues, my reading glasses, 3 individually wrapped hard candies, and my cell phone with 11% battery and no signal. I had whatever was in the cabin, which, when I inventoried it in the remaining light, turned out to be almost nothing. A box of baking soda in the cabinet under the kitchen sink, an old rain poncho hanging on a hook near the door, 2 blankets in the bedroom closet that smelled like cedar and disuse, a box of birthday candles, the kind you put on cakes, and a book of matches. No food, no water, no flashlight. Gerald had always kept a flashlight in the cabin. For 30 years, there had been a flashlight in the kitchen drawer near the stove. I pulled that drawer open and found it empty. Ethan had planned this well. The birthday candles became my light source as darkness fell. I lit them one at a time, propped in the box of baking soda, and in their small, wavering glow, I walked the cabin looking for anything I might have missed. I found one thing. In the back bedroom closet, on the highest shelf, behind a stack of folded linens that nobody had touched in years, my hand found the edge of something hard and plastic. I pulled it down and stood there in the candlelight staring at it. It was a walkie-talkie. Gerald's walkie-talkie, from the set he'd bought so we could communicate between the cabin and the dock when Ethan was a boy, and the lake felt too wide for a mother to let her son out of earshot. One of a pair. A cheap, battered little thing with a belt clip on the back and a sticker on the front that said Unit 2 in Gerald's handwriting. The battery was almost certainly dead after 30 years. Almost certainly. I pressed the power button. The walkie-talkie crackled to life. I made a sound I cannot describe, somewhere between a laugh and a sob and a prayer to no one in particular. The battery indicator showed a single bar. One bar. Enough for something, maybe. Enough for nothing, maybe. But something. "Hello?" I said into it. My voice came out strange, hoarse from crying, smaller than I expected. "Is anyone there? Hello?" Static. "Hello, my name is Vivian Carter. I'm at the old Mercer Lake property, the cabin at the end of Harrow Road. I'm locked inside. Can anyone hear me? Hello?" More static. I tried again, and again. I tried for 20 minutes until the single battery bar began to flash. And then I stopped, because if the battery died, I had nothing. I had to save what was left for when it might matter more. I sat down on the bed in the dark, because I'd burned the last birthday candle down to the baking soda, and I thought about my son. All right, here is something I have never told anyone, not even my closest friend Dolores. Not even the therapist I started seeing 2 years ago when things with Ethan began to feel genuinely frightening. The night before he brought me to the cabin, I almost didn't get in the car. We had driven out together under the pretense of doing some seasonal maintenance, closing up the cabin for winter, checking the pipes, the usual October tasks. Naomi had stayed behind, which should have struck me as unusual. Naomi went everywhere with Ethan. She monitored him with the focused attention of someone who didn't entirely trust what he might do or say without supervision. For her to stay home was not normal. But I got in the car. Because Ethan had been almost like himself that morning. Not entirely. Not the way he used to be when he was 22 and finishing college and would call me on Tuesday evenings just to talk. Not because he needed anything, just because he wanted to tell me about his day. That version of my son had been gone for years. But that morning, he'd held the car door open for me, and when I climbed in, he said, "Careful, Mom, the step's a little high," the way he used to do, the way a son does when he still thinks of his mother as someone worth protecting. I should have known it was a performance. Instead, I smiled at him. I settled into the passenger seat, and I thought, maybe things are getting better. Maybe the distance between us is finally closing. Maybe we can find our way back. I thought those things the entire drive out to the lake. I was still thinking them when we pulled up to the cabin, and he said he needed to check something around the back of the building first. Could I go inside and open a few windows to let the place air out? He'd be right there. I went inside. The door clicked shut behind me. The thing about being betrayed by someone you love is that the mind doesn't accept it all at once. The mind comes at it sideways, slowly, in stages, the way you might approach an animal you're afraid of, cautiously, with many retreats, because the full reality of the thing is too large to take in directly. Sitting on that bed in the dark, I began to let myself take it in. My son had put me here on purpose. My son knew, when he drove away, that I had no food and no water and no way to call for help. My son knew the temperature would drop below freezing overnight. My son knew that no one was likely to come down Harrow Road until hunting season, which was 2 weeks away. My son had done the math on his own mother's survival and decided it was an acceptable risk. Why? Because of the will. Because 3 weeks earlier, I had sat across the kitchen table from Ethan and Naomi and told them, as clearly as I could manage, that I had made some changes to my estate planning and I wanted them to be aware of it. I told them that I was leaving the cabin property to a land conservancy that would protect it from development. I told them that a significant portion of my financial assets were being redirected to a foundation I was in the process of establishing. I told them that Ethan would still be provided for. I wasn't disowning him. I wasn't punishing him. I was simply making choices about my own life and my own resources that reflected my own values. Naomi's face had gone very still. How significant, she said, is a significant portion. Naomi, Ethan said. No, she said. I want to know what significant means, because we've been... She stopped herself, reorganized, smiled the smile that never touched her eyes. We've been counting on certain things, Vivian. It's important for us to understand what this means for our planning. It means, I said, that it's my money and my property, and I will do with it what I think is right. The conversation ended shortly after that. 3 weeks later, my son put me in this cabin and drove away. I want to tell you how I got here. Not to the cabin, but to this moment, this point in my life where my son was capable of this. Because it didn't happen overnight. Nothing this devastating ever does. It happened the way most damage happens. Slowly, incrementally, in moves so small that you keep finding reasons to explain them away. I was 42 years old when Gerald died. Ethan was 19, just starting his second year of college. The loss of his father changed him in ways I watched happen and couldn't stop. He became harder, more guarded, more focused on outcomes and achievement in a way that left less room for softness. I understood it. Grief does different things to different people, and a 19-year-old boy losing his father is a particular kind of devastation. I gave him room, I gave him time, I gave him money I could barely spare to cover what his scholarship didn't, because I needed him to be able to finish school and build something. He finished school. He built something. He became a successful financial analyst with a corner office and a salary that would have astonished the version of him who once asked me to help him buy groceries because his account was overdrawn. And somewhere in the building of that success, I lost him. I couldn't tell you the exact moment. There wasn't one. It was a series of small withdrawals, phone calls that got shorter, visits that got less frequent, conversations that became summaries of information rather than actual exchanges between people who knew each other. By the time he was 35, I sometimes felt like I was talking to someone who was performing the role of my son rather than actually being him. Then he met Naomi. Naomi Whitfield was 32 when Ethan brought her home for the first time, and I want to be fair to her because this story is easier to tell if she's simply a villain, and I don't think the truth is that simple. I think Naomi was a woman who had decided very early what kind of life she wanted and had organized everything, her choices, her relationships, her persona, around the efficient acquisition of that life. I don't think she was incapable of genuine feeling. I think she had simply made a decision, somewhere along the way, that genuine feeling was a liability. She was beautiful in a precise, deliberate way. She was charming when charm was useful and cold when it wasn't. She assessed me at that first dinner the way you might assess a property, noting the condition, estimating the value, calculating the complications. I felt it. I smiled back at her, and I felt it. But Ethan was happy in a way he hadn't been in years, loose and laughing, reaching across the table to touch her hand. And I loved my son. So I pushed the feeling down and told myself I was being paranoid, that any mother was liable to be suspicious of the woman who came and reorganized her son's priorities, that this was just the adjustment period and it would get easier. It got harder. Within a year of their marriage, Ethan had stopped calling on Tuesday evenings. He'd stopped coming to Christmas dinner unless Naomi's schedule permitted it. He'd started referring to family obligations, the small, ordinary obligations of having a living mother, as things that were difficult to manage and a lot to ask, and not really reasonable, Mom, when you think about it from our perspective. I started to understand that from our perspective meant from Naomi's perspective, and from Naomi's perspective, I was a problem to be managed. The winter after they got married, I had a health scare. It wasn't as serious as it initially seemed, a cardiac episode, the doctor said, something that required monitoring and medication adjustment and rest. But for 3 days, before the test came back and the picture became clearer, I was in the hospital and I was frightened in the way you're only frightened when the possibility of your own death becomes suddenly, physically, real. I called Ethan from the hospital room. He didn't come. He called back 4 hours later and told me he and Naomi were in the middle of something important, a work dinner that was actually a client event that had taken months to arrange. And he would drive up on the weekend if I still needed him. But I sounded okay on the phone. Didn't I sound okay? I told him I sounded okay. I lay in that hospital bed, and I talked to a nurse named Rosemary, who had the night shift, and she brought me an extra blanket because the room was cold, and I thought, a woman I have known for 4 hours is taking better care of me right now than my son. I didn't say that to Ethan. I didn't say it to anyone. I tucked it away in the part of myself where I kept the things that were too painful to look at directly, and I kept going. Mothers do that. We keep going, but things accumulate. The money problem started 2 years into the marriage. I don't know whose idea it was. I have my suspicions, but I genuinely don't know. What I know is that Ethan started asking, first tentatively, then more directly, then with an edge of entitlement that frightened me, for access to money. Not gifts, at first. Loans, he called them. He needed to cover a gap while an investment matured. He needed to front some cash for a real estate opportunity that required quick action. He needed help with a tax situation that was temporarily awkward. The amounts grew. The repayment schedules, which he provided in detail in the early requests, became vaguer and then non-existent. When I raised the subject of what he owed me, the conversations went sideways. He became defensive or hurt or both, and somehow by the end, I was the one apologizing for bringing it up. I loaned him $60,000 over the course of 3 years. He repaid 11 of it. I didn't tell anyone because I was ashamed. Not of him, of myself, for letting it happen, for wanting so badly to believe that he needed me and that being needed was a form of love. It wasn't love. I know that now. It was utility. I was useful. And when I stopped being useful, when I sat across that kitchen table and told them the inheritance they were counting on looked different than they'd assumed, I became something else. I became an obstacle. Lying on that musty-smelling bed in the dark, with a single-bar walkie-talkie pressed against my chest and temperatures I knew were dropping toward freezing, I found something unexpected moving through me beneath the fear. Anger. Not the hot, trembling anger of the moment that had burned through me hours ago. This was something cooler and more durable, the kind of anger that doesn't exhaust itself because it has found solid ground to stand on. I was angry at Ethan. I was angry at Naomi. But most of all, and this surprised me, I was angry at myself. I was angry at every time I had swallowed the truth to preserve his comfort. I was angry at every apology I'd made for having needs. I was angry at $61,000. I was angry at a hospital room where I lay alone and told myself it was fine. I was angry at every birthday candle I'd lit for a man who had already, in all the ways that mattered, stopped showing up. I lay in that dark and let the anger settle into something cold and clear and useful. And I started to think. Dick, here is what I knew. I knew that Ethan would expect me to panic. He would expect me to fall apart, to be broken by this, to emerge from whatever version of rescue eventually arrived so frightened and diminished that I would sign whatever he put in front of me just to feel safe again. He had read my softness as weakness and weakness as leverage. He had miscalculated. I was not the woman I had been 5 years ago. I was not even the woman I had been 2 years ago, before Dolores talked me into joining her book club, and I met a retired attorney named Francis McAllister who told me, over terrible Chardonnay, that what I was describing in my son's behavior had a name and a legal category, and that I had more options than I knew. I had spent the last 18 months quietly, carefully, with the focused patience of someone who has finally understood the stakes, making sure that I had options. They didn't know about Francis. They didn't know about the changes I had already made. Not the ones I'd mentioned at the kitchen table, which were real, but the ones beneath those, the ones that had been in place for 8 months. The ones that didn't require their cooperation or their approval. They didn't know what I had in the safety deposit box at First National Bank. They didn't know what Francis's colleague had been holding in his office for the last 6 months. They thought they knew me. They thought I was the same woman who had swallowed every cruelty and smiled through every absence and loaned money she couldn't afford because she needed to believe she was loved. In the dark of that cabin, with my dead husband's walkie-talkie pressed against my chest, I smiled. Let them think that. Let them sit in first class on their flight to Hawaii and believe they had won. They had no idea what was waiting for them when they got back. Sometime around what I estimated was 10 o'clock, I pressed the power button on the walkie-talkie again. "Hello?" I said. "Is anyone on this frequency? This is Vivian Carter at the Mercer Lake property on Harrow Road. I need help. Can anyone hear me?" Static. Then, almost imperceptibly, something else. A sound that might have been a voice. "Hello?" I said again, louder. "I'm locked inside the cabin. Can you hear me?" The static shifted, and then, thin and broken and the most beautiful thing I had heard in my entire life, a voice came through. "Hear you, ma'am. What? Location? You say Harrow Road?" "Yes," I said, and I was crying again, but differently this time. "Yes, Harrow Road. The cabin at the end. The door is locked from the outside. I need someone to come." More static. Then, "Got it. Stay calm. We're—" The battery died. The walkie-talkie went dark in my hand. I sat in the complete blackness of the cabin and breathed. In, out, in, out. I had been heard. Someone had heard me. The rest was waiting, and waiting was something I had spent a lifetime learning how to do. I pulled both blankets from the closet and wrapped them around myself and sat against the wall that I estimated faced south, because south walls hold a little more warmth than the others, and I waited. 3 hours later, I heard gravel crunching under tires. Then voices. Then a light sweeping across the covered windows from outside. A flashlight, or maybe more than one. Then a fist on the door. "Ma'am? Ma'am, this is Deputy Aldridge with the county sheriff. Are you in there?" "Yes," I said. My voice came out barely above a whisper. I tried again, louder. "Yes, I'm here. I'm here." It took them 11 minutes to get the door open. I counted. When the cold air hit my face and the flashlight blinded me, there were two of them. A young deputy with a jaw like a shovel and a second officer who I would learn was named Gaines. And they both looked at me with the specific expression of people who have found something they were afraid they weren't going to find in time. "Ma'am, are you injured?" "No," I said. "I'm cold and I'm angry, and I'd like some water if you have any." Deputy Aldridge looked at Deputy Gaines. "Who put you in here, ma'am?" he said. I wrapped the blanket tighter around my shoulders. "My son," I said. The words sat there between us in the cold night air. My son did this. And that was the moment. Not when the door had clicked shut, not when the darkness fell, not even when the battery died. That was the moment it became completely, irreversibly real to me. Not just what Ethan had done, what I was going to do about it. Deputy Aldridge was writing something in his notebook. His breath made small clouds in the October air. "Can you give me his name and contact information, ma'am?" "I can give you quite a lot more than that," I said. And I found that I was no longer cold. Deputy Aldridge drove me to the county hospital himself, which I hadn't asked for, but which I didn't argue against because my hands were still shaking and I wasn't sure they were going to stop anytime soon. Deputy Gaines stayed behind at the cabin to document what had been done to it. The plywood over the windows, the disabled deadbolt, the cut water line, the emptied kitchen. I learned later that he took 47 photographs that night. 47. Each one a piece of evidence, each one a small, precise record of how much planning my son had put into making sure I couldn't escape. I sat in the passenger seat of Aldridge's cruiser with a thermal blanket around my shoulders and a bottle of water in both hands because one wasn't steady enough, and I stared out the window at the dark road unspooling ahead of us. "You don't have to talk right now," Aldridge said. He had a careful voice, the kind of voice that had learned to be useful in situations where the wrong word could break something. "I know," I said, "but I'd like to, if that's all right." "That's all right. I want to tell you exactly what happened, all of it, from the beginning." I paused. "Because there's more to this than one night." Aldridge glanced at me sideways. "How much more?" "Years," I said. He didn't say anything to that. He just nodded and reached over and turned down the radio, and I started talking. I talked for most of the 40-minute drive. I told him about the kitchen table conversation 3 weeks earlier, about the will, about Naomi's face going still. I told him about the borrowed money, about the hospital room where I lay alone, I told him about the walkie-talkie and the birthday candles and the box of baking soda and the 47 photographs that Deputy Gaines was taking in the dark. When I finished, Aldridge was quiet for a moment. "You said you have documentation," he said, "of the financial stuff, the loans." "I have everything," I said. "Texts, emails, bank records. I have a letter he wrote me 2 years ago promising to repay the full amount on a specific schedule. He broke every date on that schedule." "And you kept the letter?" "I kept everything," I said. "I've been keeping everything for longer than he knows." Aldridge was quiet again. The hospital lights appeared ahead on the horizon. "Mrs. Carter," he said carefully, "I want to be honest with you about something. What happened tonight, what was done to that cabin, that's serious. That's not a family argument, that's not a misunderstanding. Depending on how this is documented, we're potentially looking at elder abuse, false imprisonment, criminal mischief. That's real." "I know it's real," I said. "I just want to make sure you understand that once we open this, it doesn't close easily. Are you prepared for that?" I looked at him. In the pale light from the dashboard, he looked very young and very earnest and a little worried, not for himself, but for me, in the way that decent people worry for people they have just pulled out of dark places. "Deputy," I said, "I've been closing things for 30 years to protect that boy. Every hurt, every disappointment, every time he chose Naomi over basic human decency. I closed it. I made excuses. I told myself it would get better." I looked back at the road. "I am done closing things." He nodded once, slowly. "Okay," he said. "Then let's do this right." But the hospital kept me for one night, which I didn't fight because by the time they got a warm IV into my arm and checked my vitals and confirmed that the mild hypothermia was mild and that my heart, which the admitting nurse kept watching with slightly more attention than seemed routine, was behaving itself. By the time all that was done, it was 2 a.m, and I was too tired to insist on going home to an empty house. Dolores arrived at 6:30 the next morning with a paper bag full of food from the diner 3 blocks from her house. Scrambled eggs, wheat toast, orange juice, a coffee that was too sweet because Dolores always put too much sugar in coffee without thinking. She sat in the chair beside my bed and looked at me for a long time without saying anything. And then she said, "I'm going to kill him." "You're not," I said. "I'm going to find him in Hawaii, and I'm going to—" "Dolores. He left you in a cabin, Vivian. He nailed the windows shut and left you in a cabin with no water, and it was 31 degrees last night." "I know what he did." "Then stop telling me to calm down." "I didn't tell you to calm down. I told you you're not going to kill him." She stared at me, and then, in the way that only people who have known each other for 32 years can do, she read something in my face and shifted. "You have a plan," she said. "I have several plans," I said. "Some of them have been in place for a while." She stared at me a moment longer, then she leaned forward and handed me the coffee. "Tell me everything," she said. So I did. And this time I told her the parts I had never told anyone. Not because I had been protecting Ethan, but because I had been protecting myself from the humiliation of admitting how long I had allowed it to go on. I told her about the $60,000. I told her about the nursing facility conversation. That part stopped her cold. "What nursing facility conversation?" she said. "About 8 months ago," I said. "Before I knew, or before I let myself know, how serious things had gotten. Ethan sat me down and told me he and Naomi had been thinking about my long-term care needs. He said they'd found a very nice facility about 2 hours away, excellent ratings, beautiful grounds. He'd even printed out a brochure." Dolores's mouth had gone into a tight line. "He said it would be the responsible thing to do, to start the process early, before it became an emergency. He said the cabin and the house would need to be liquidated to cover the costs, but that I shouldn't worry about that. They would handle all of it." I took a sip of the too sweet coffee. He was very calm about it, very reasonable sounding. That was the thing that frightened me most, how reasonable he sounded. "What did you say?" I told him I would think about it. "And then?" "And then I called Frances McAllister and told her everything." Dolores closed her eyes briefly. "Good," she said. "Okay, good." The nursing facility plan was the moment I understood what I was actually dealing with, I said. Up until then, I had been making allowances, telling myself that the money was a problem, that his distance was a problem, that Naomi's influence was a problem, but that underneath all of it, Ethan still loved me in some fundamental way that would eventually reassert itself. The nursing facility conversation ended that. Because he wasn't trying to help you, Dolores said. He was trying to remove me, I said. Efficiently and with plausible deniability. Put me somewhere I couldn't object to anything, liquidate the assets, move on. I put down the coffee cup. He'd been planning it for at least a year, probably longer. Dolores sat back in her chair. She looked at the ceiling. She was working through something, I could tell, cataloging, processing, the same thing she did when we tackled complicated jigsaw puzzles, except the stakes were somewhat higher. How long have you been building your defense? She finally asked. 8 months of active work, I said, though I'd been gathering documents for about a year before that, informally. I didn't fully understand why I was doing it until Francis helped me see the pattern. Does Ethan know any of it? He knows about the changes I told him about, the ones I mentioned at the kitchen table. A pause. He doesn't know about the others. Dolores looked at me with an expression that was half admiration and half something that might have been relief. You were ready for this, she said. Not for the cabin, I said honestly. The physical thing, the locking me in, I didn't anticipate that specific move. I thought they would try legal pressure, maybe a competency hearing, something like that. I didn't think he would. I stopped, steadied myself. But the documentation, the legal structures, the account protections, yes, I was ready for those. So what happens now? Now, I said, we wait for him to come home from Hawaii. The thing nobody tells you about being betrayed by your own child is that it doesn't happen in a single catastrophic moment. It happens in 100 smaller moments, each one individually survivable, each one leaving behind a tiny deposit of something you can't quite name. Not quite grief, not quite anger, something that sits in the chest and slowly changes the chemical composition of the love that's already there. I know exactly when it started with Ethan, not the cabin, not the money, not the nursing facility brochure. It started on a Sunday evening in November, about 4 months after he married Naomi. I had cooked dinner. This sounds simple, but understand what it meant. I had made his grandmother's pot roast, which takes most of a day and which I had been making for Ethan since he was small. I had set the table. I had bought a decent wine because Naomi mentioned once that she preferred reds from the Pacific Northwest. I had cleaned the house in a way that involved moving furniture because I knew without asking, that Naomi was the kind of person who noticed what was behind the couch. They were supposed to arrive at 6. At 6:45, Ethan called. Mom, we're not going to make it tonight. Naomi has a headache. I stood in my kitchen with the pot roast going cold on the counter and the table set for 3 and the Pacific Northwest wine breathing, and I said, Okay, sweetheart, I hope she feels better. She just needs to rest. We'll do it another time. Of course. You're not upset. It wasn't really a question. It was a check, a quick calibration to make sure I wasn't going to make this complicated for him. No, I said. I'm fine. I wasn't fine. I was standing in a clean kitchen with a ruined dinner, feeling the specific loneliness of a person who has prepared for connection and arrived to find nobody home. But I said I was fine because that was what I did. That was what I had been doing since Gerald died, and the loneliness became a permanent texture of my life. And the alternative to saying I was fine was admitting how much I needed my son, which felt like a burden I had no right to place on him. The mistake wasn't saying I was fine. The mistake was that I genuinely believed in that moment that protecting him from my needs was an act of love. It wasn't. It was a lie. And like all lies told out of kindness, it taught him something false, that my feelings didn't cost anything, that I was inexhaustible, that he could take, and the supply would never run low because I would keep generating it, the way some people believe money works when they've never had to worry about money. I think about that Sunday evening often. I think about how everything might have been different if I had said, clearly and without apology, Ethan, I cooked for you all day and I'm disappointed. I'd like you to find a way to come, or at least to call sooner next time. I didn't say it. I said, I'm fine. And every time after that, when I said I'm fine, I was teaching him that I was. What Naomi understood about Ethan from very early on was that his relationship with me was a vulnerability. Not because he loved me too much, but because he felt guilty about loving me too little, and guilt, in a certain kind of person, curdles into resentment faster than almost anything else. She didn't manufacture his distance from me. She just fertilized it, gave it room and justification and a narrative that made it feel not like abandonment, but like self-preservation. I learned this partly from watching and partly from something I wasn't supposed to see. About 2 years into their marriage, I visited unannounced. I know that visiting unannounced is the kind of thing mothers-in-law aren't supposed to do. And I had broken my own rule because I had been driving past their neighborhood on the way back from a dentist's appointment, and I had bought a container of the lemon cookies Ethan had loved since he was 12. And I was trying, still, to find the small gestures that might keep us connected. I knocked. Nobody answered, but I could hear voices inside. They hadn't heard me pull up. I tried the door and it was unlocked, which in retrospect I should have registered as a sign to leave, but I called out, "It's just me," and pushed it open and walked into the kitchen doorway. Naomi was at the island with a glass of wine. Ethan was across from her, and they were mid-conversation, not arguing, just talking, but intensely. The way people talk when they've been circling something for a while. And she just shows up whenever she feels like it, Naomi was saying. She doesn't respect our space, Ethan. She never has. She means well, Ethan said. It was the weak defense, the one that sounds like protection but is actually a concession. I'm sure she does. But meaning well and being appropriate are two different things. She calls you 3 times a week. She tells you how to handle your finances. She has opinions about our vacations. Naomi set down her wine glass. She's controlling, and you can't see it because she's your mother. She's not, Ethan started. She told you that job in Denver was a mistake. You almost didn't take it because of her. That was different. How? How is it different? She inserts herself into everything, and then you feel guilty when you push back, so you don't push back and then you resent her for it. You told me that. You said you resent her sometimes. A silence. That's not... I didn't mean it the way you're making it sound. I'm not making it sound like anything. I'm repeating what you told me. She picked the glass back up. Calm. Entirely calm. I'm just saying that at some point, you have to decide whether you're living your life or hers. I backed out of the doorway before either of them saw me. I set the lemon cookies on the porch, and I drove home, and I sat in my car in my driveway for a long time before I could make myself go inside. I was not controlling. I need to say that clearly, not defensively but accurately. I need to say it the way you state a fact that has been systematically replaced with a fiction until you can barely remember which is which. I called Ethan twice a week, sometimes 3 times during the early years when he was figuring out his career and calling me. I had reservations about the Denver job because it would have moved him 1,200 miles away at a time when his father had just died, and I didn't think either of us was ready for that distance. I shared those reservations once, and when he decided to stay, I never mentioned it again. That is not control. That is a mother with a point of view. But Naomi had found the version of events that positioned my presence as an intrusion and my concern as a grip, and she had been delivering it to Ethan, slowly, consistently, with the patience of someone building a structure meant to last, for long enough that he had started to believe it. I didn't confront her about what I'd heard. Another mistake on my long list of mistakes. I chose, instead, to be more careful, to call less, to offer opinions less, to take up less space, make fewer demands, need less visibly, as if loving your child was something that needed to be done quietly so as not to disturb anyone. The borrowed money is the part of this story I have the hardest time talking about, not because of the amount, though $60,000 is not nothing to a woman living on a teacher's pension and Gerald's life insurance, but because of the way each request was made and what the making of it revealed about who my son had become. The first request came 3 years into the marriage. Ethan called on a Tuesday, which used to be our day, and his voice had the particular quality it got when he needed something, a kind of studied casualness that he thought concealed the ask but actually preceded it so reliably that I'd learned to recognize it as a signal. "How are things?" he said. "Fine," I said. "How are you?" "Good, good, really good, actually. There's an opportunity that's come up. Investment property, good location, the returns are solid. Naomi and I have been looking at it seriously." "That sounds interesting." "The thing is, there's a timing issue. We need to move quickly and our liquidity is tied up in the market right now, and I was wondering if—" A pause. Studied. "If you might be in a position to help bridge the gap, temporarily, just until we can restructure." The amount he asked for was $15,000. He told me the repayment timeline was 60 days. I transferred the money 2 days later. At 90 days, nothing had come back. When I mentioned it, gently, he said the investment timeline had shifted and it would be another month. I said, "Okay." "At 5 months?" I asked again. He said the market had done something unexpected. I said, "Okay." I never stopped saying okay. The second request came a year later. Different framing, a tax situation, an accountant's error, something that would resolve itself but needed immediate covering. $20,000. I asked more questions this time. He answered them patiently, with specific numbers and clear timelines, and I noticed that his answers were very good. Too rehearsed to be spontaneous, too detailed to be honest. And I transferred the money anyway because he was my son, and I didn't want to believe what the quality of his answers was telling me. The third and fourth requests followed. The amounts varied, the excuses varied, the outcome never did. What I never told Ethan, what I never told anyone until Francis, was that the last transfer, $12,000, had required me to cash in a retirement account. The penalties and taxes cost me nearly $4,000 on top of the withdrawal. I paid them without saying a word because I had reached the point where I was more afraid of his reaction to a refusal than I was of the actual financial harm. That is a thing I am not proud of. That is a thing I have had to sit with. The understanding that fear had replaced judgment somewhere along the way, quietly and completely, the way rust replaces metal. Frances McAllister, when I finally told her about the money, did not tell me I was stupid. She told me I was isolated, which is different, and that isolation is how this kind of thing works. You remove someone from their own perspective, one small step at a time, until they lose the ability to measure what's happening against anything but the distorted reality they've been handed. "You weren't weak," Frances said. "You were managed." That word, managed, landed with the weight of something true tate. The weeks between the cabin and Ethan's return from Hawaii were the strangest of my life, and I have lived through some strange weeks. Dolores stayed with me. She slept in the guest room and made coffee too strong every morning and watched old movies with me in the evenings without requiring me to talk, which was exactly what I needed. My neighbor Martin, who was 73 and had been quietly bringing in my mail and checking on my house for 2 years without making a production of it, started stopping by in the afternoons on some pretext or other. A borrowed garden tool, a question about the best route to somewhere he was going, a piece of mail he'd accidentally received. These people had been around me for years, and I had not fully understood. Until the cabin. How much they mattered. I had been so focused on the relationship that was failing that I had not properly attended to the ones that were holding. Frances called me 3 days after I got home from the hospital. "I've spoken to the DA's office," she said. Frances had a voice like an old courthouse, solid, unhurried, built to last. "The photographs from the cabin are compelling. Deputy Gaines is thorough. Combined with the financial documentation we already have, we're in a strong position." "What does strong mean?" I asked. "It means that when Ethan and Naomi come home from Hawaii, they're going to be met with something they are not prepared for." A pause. "Have you heard from him?" "He texted on the second day, asking if I was okay." I had stared at that text for a long time before answering. I told him I was fine. A beat. "Old habit," I said. "Yes," Frances said without judgment. "Well, The last time you say it, I expect. She was right about that. I sat in my living room after that call and looked around at the familiar shapes of my life. The photograph of Gerald and me on our 10th anniversary, the lamp I'd found at an estate sale in 1994, the bookshelf Ethan had built me for Mother's Day when he was 16 with wood he'd bought with lawn mowing money, slightly uneven on the left side, beautiful to me in a way no perfect thing could be. He had built that for me. That boy had been real. The boy who saved lawn mowing money and measured wrong and was proud of it anyway. He had been real. Something had happened to him, slowly and over years, and I had watched it happen without understanding what I was watching. I carried grief for that boy. I carried it honestly, without pretending it wasn't there, because the grief was appropriate. You can grieve someone who is still alive. You can grieve the version of them that no longer exists. But grief and surrender are not the same thing. I was not surrendering. I reached for the phone and called Francis back. "There's one more thing I haven't told you about," I said. "The recordings." A brief silence. "What recordings, Vivian?" "Starting about 7 months ago," I said. "After the nursing facility conversation. I have a small device, a digital recorder. I started carrying it in my purse whenever I was with Ethan and Naomi." I paused. "I have 14 separate recordings. Some of them are just uncomfortable, but some of them—" "Vivian." Francis's voice had changed, sharper, focused. "What's on the others?" "The conversation where Ethan told me I should start thinking about who would make medical decisions when I was no longer capable of making them myself." His words. "When was this?" "April, 6 months ago." "What else?" "The dinner in July where Naomi told me, in front of Ethan, that I was living in the past and that my attachment to the house and the cabin was not healthy and that it was time to think practically." "And Ethan's response?" I closed my eyes. Heard it again. He said, "Mom, she has a point. We're just trying to look out for you." And when I said I didn't need to be looked out for, he said, "A breath. That's exactly the kind of thinking that worries us." The silence on Francis's end was the silence of a woman doing calculations. 14 recordings, she said. "Yes. And they're stored not on my phone, not in my house. In the safety deposit box at First National. I made copies. One set is with you." Another silence. "Vivian," Francis said, and there was something in her voice I hadn't heard before. Something warm and a little fierce, the way a person sounds when they are genuinely pleased. "I want you to know something." "What?" "When they get off that plane," she said, "they're going to think they are coming home to clean up a mess. They have no idea they are walking into one." I looked at Gerald's photograph on the wall. I looked at the crooked bookshelf. "I know," I said quietly. And for the first time since the door had clicked shut in that cabin, I felt something settle in my chest. Not happiness exactly. Something more durable than happiness. Readiness. Ethan and Naomi landed on a Thursday. I know the exact time because Dolores, who had been tracking their flight on her phone with an intensity that would have been alarming under other circumstances, told me when they touched down. "They're back," she said from the kitchen doorway. I was sitting at the table with a cup of tea and a legal pad on which I had been writing nothing, just holding the pen, thinking. "Okay," I said. "Francis says the meeting is set for Monday." "I know." Dolores came in and sat across from me. She looked at my face carefully. "How are you doing?" she said. "I've been better," I said. "And I've been worse. Right now, I'm somewhere in the middle, which is honestly fine." "Are you scared?" I thought about it honestly. "Not of them," I said. "I'm a little scared of what it means. That after Monday, there's no version of this where Ethan and I go back to being whatever we were before." A pause. "But I think that version was already gone. I think it's been gone for years, and I was just too—" I stopped, started again. "Too hopeful to notice." Dolores was quiet for a moment. "He texted you again," she said. It wasn't a question, she'd seen it come in on my phone, which I'd left on the counter. "Yes." "What did he say?" I picked up the phone, read it to her. Mom, I know things got complicated before the trip. I think we need to sit down when we get back and talk through everything. I want to sort things out. Dolores's expression did not change. Things got complicated, she repeated. Yes. He thinks he left you in a cabin in 31-degree weather and things got complicated. I know what he thinks. What did you write back? I showed her my response. Sure, Ethan, let's talk soon. She looked at it, at me, at it again. You're not going to warn him, she said. No. You're going to let him walk into Monday thinking you want to sort things out. He made his choices without warning me, I said. I think I'm entitled to make mine the same way. Dolores put the phone down on the table between us. Sometimes, she said, you scare me a little. Good, I said. I picked up my tea. Outside the window, the yard was November bare. The maple in the corner down to its last few leaves, everything stripped back to what it actually was. No softening color, no full canopy illusion of abundance, just the true shape of things, which is all you ever actually need to see if you're willing to look. Monday was coming, and I was ready. Monday arrived the way significant days often do, unremarkably. The sky was flat and gray, the kind of November sky that commits to nothing. I made coffee. I fed the neighbor's cat, who had taken to sitting on my porch steps every morning for reasons nobody had ever adequately explained. I put on a blouse that Dolores said made me look like a woman who had her affairs in order, which was exactly the impression I wanted to make. Frances arrived at 8:30. She came in through the front door, set her briefcase on the kitchen table, accepted a cup of coffee, and spent 20 minutes going through the sequence of the morning with me in the precise, unhurried way she did everything. Frances was 64, a year younger than me. With silver hair she kept short, and reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck. She had been practicing family and estate law for 31 years. She had the manner of someone who had sat across from a great many people who believed they were in control of a situation they had already lost. They'll be expecting a conversation, she said, not a proceeding. I know. When they realize it's not a conversation, Naomi will try to redirect. She'll reframe, minimize, look for a way to change the terms of the room. Don't let her. I won't. And Ethan... Frances paused, weighing something. Ethan may get emotional. People in his position sometimes do when they understand what they're facing. It's not remorse, necessarily. It's fear dressed up as remorse. Don't let that redirect you either. I know the difference, I said. Frances looked at me over her coffee cup. Yes, she said. I believe you do. Dolores was upstairs, under strict instructions to stay there until I called her down. She had argued about this with the particular intensity she reserved for arguments she knew she was going to lose, and then she'd gone upstairs and I could hear her up there now, pacing. I sat in my chair in the living room, Gerald's photograph on the wall, the crooked bookshelf, the lamp from the estate sale, my home, mine, built from 30 years of a life actually lived in it. At 9:15, Ethan's car turned into the driveway. I heard two doors close, his and hers. I heard their footsteps on the porch, and even that small sound told me something. They were walking in step, which meant they had been in the car together coordinating, planning, agreeing on how this morning was going to go. Ethan knocked. He always knocked now, which had started 3 years ago, and which I had tried not to read as the statement it was, that he had reclassified this house from home to somewhere he visited. I let him knock twice before I went to the door. When I opened it, he was standing slightly in front of Naomi, which I read as Naomi's positioning rather than his instinct. She liked to let him lead in situations that might turn adversarial, so that whatever happened first would happen to him and she could adjust. Ethan looked, I searched for the right word and kept arriving at the same one, rehearsed. He had prepared an expression for this morning, something calibrated to read as concerned and a little contrite without admitting to anything specific. He was wearing a blue sweater I recognized, one I had given him 4 Christmases ago. I don't know if that was calculated or coincidental, and I decided not to waste energy figuring it out. Mom, he said, you look good. Are you feeling okay? Come in, I said. Naomi smiled as she crossed the threshold. Vivian, we were so worried when we heard what happened. Are you really all right? We came back as soon as we could manage. Sit down, I said. Something in my voice stopped her mid-sentence. She looked at me. Really looked. The way she hadn't bothered to in years because she had decided I wasn't worth the full attention. And I watched the first small flicker of recalibration cross her face. They sat on the couch. I sat in my chair across from them. And Francis, who had been standing in the kitchen doorway, stepped into the room. Ethan looked at her. His expression shifted. Mom, who is this? This is Frances McAllister. She's my attorney. A silence. Naomi was the first to recover. She recovered fast. I'll give her that. Oh, she said pleasantly. That's fine. We're just here to talk, so that's perfectly fine. She glanced at Ethan in a way that was meant to be subtle and wasn't. We have nothing to hide. I know you don't think you do, I said. Ethan leaned forward. Mom, I want to explain about the cabin. I know it looked... I'd like you to listen first, I said. You'll have a chance to talk, but I'd like you to listen first. He sat back. His jaw had gone tight. Frances opened her briefcase and set a folder on the coffee table. She did this calmly, without ceremony, the way you set down something that has weight but doesn't need to announce it. Mrs. Carter has asked me to walk through some documentation this morning, Frances said. After that, she'll have some things to say directly. We're not here to negotiate. We're here to inform. Inform us of what? Naomi said. Her pleasant voice had taken on the particular texture it got when she was managing something she found irritating. We're family. This feels very... Formal, I said. Unnecessary, she said. After what happened at the cabin, I said, I think it's exactly necessary. Ethan's face did something complicated. Mom, I know it was wrong. What happened at the cabin was, I made a decision I shouldn't have made, and I'm sorry. I panicked. Things got out of hand, and I panicked, and I put you in a situation that was... Ethan, my voice was quiet, completely steady. You nailed plywood over the windows, you cut the water line, you disabled the deadbolt. I paused. People who panic don't do 3 separate specific things to make sure someone can't get out. His mouth closed. That took planning, I said. That took time, so please don't tell me you panicked. The room went very quiet. Frances began with the financial documentation. She was methodical about it, not theatrical, not prosecutorial, just clear. She laid out the loan history, dates, amounts, the repayment promises Ethan had put in writing, the actual payments made. She presented the bank records showing each transfer out of my accounts. She showed the letter Ethan had written 2 years ago with the repayment schedule he had broken every single date on. Ethan stared at the table while she went through it. Naomi, to her credit, maintained her composure better than he did. She sat with her hands folded and her expression arranged into something that was probably meant to look like patient attention and read instead like a person doing rapid calculations. The total, Frances said, across 4 separate loans over a 3-year period is $61,200. Against that, $11,000 was repaid in the first 18 months. The remaining $50,200 has not been repaid, and as of today, no repayment arrangement is in effect. We intended to repay all of it, Naomi said. There were market conditions. That's noted, Frances said. She moved on. The nursing facility documentation came next. Frances had the brochure. Ethan had left it on my kitchen table that day, and I had kept it, slipped it into a folder along with a note I'd written to myself that evening, describing exactly what had been said and in what order. Frances read from the note without editorial comment, just the facts of the conversation, just the words as I had recorded them. Ethan had gone pale. Mom, he said, we were trying to think ahead, about your care. That's not the same week you gave me that brochure, I said. You contacted a real estate agent about this property. He went very still. I watched the stillness move through him and recognized it. It was the stillness of a person whose story has just developed a hole they can't immediately explain. I know this because the agent, a woman named Hartley with Meridian Realty, Called my home number by mistake instead of your cell, I said. She left a voicemail. She was following up on your inquiry about current valuations and said she was excited to help you explore your options. I kept my voice even. I have that voicemail. I have had it for 8 months. Naomi's composed expression cracked, just slightly, along one edge. That was a preliminary inquiry, she said. An informal conversation. That's not... It's consistent with a pattern, Frances said. She was already opening the next section of the folder. Ishtes. The recordings were the part I'd thought most carefully about. Not whether to use them, but how. Frances had advised me on the legal dimensions, single-party consent, which covered all 14 recordings in our state. Everything I'd captured was admissible. The question was sequence. We didn't play all 14. We played 4. Frances had a small speaker, the kind that looks like nothing, and she set it on the coffee table and pressed play on her phone, and the first recording filled the room. It was the April conversation. Ethan's voice, my son's voice, in my kitchen, talking about who would make medical decisions when I was no longer capable. Talking about the house as if it were a logistical problem rather than a place where I had lived my life. Talking around me, past me, about me, while I sat across from him and said very little because I had already begun to understand what I was dealing with and I was already recording. I watched Ethan's face while he listened to himself. There is a particular expression that comes over a person when they hear their own words played back in context. When the careful framings they'd built around those words in their memory are stripped away, and what's left is just the raw meaning of what they said. His face did that. It went through several things: recognition, something close to shame, and then the thing that replaced shame in people who were not ready to feel it fully, a quick pivot toward argument. That's out of context, he said, before the first recording was even finished. You're hearing a fragment of a much longer... Frances pressed play on the second recording. This one was July. Naomi at the dinner table, her voice smooth and social and absolutely certain. My attachment to the house and the cabin was not healthy. I was living in the past. It was time to think practically. Ethan's voice underneath hers, agreeing, adjusting, finding the language that allowed him to endorse what she was saying without having to fully own it. And then, that's exactly the kind of thinking that worries us. Naomi stood up. I want to stop this, she said. I don't consent to being recorded, and I don't consent to... You don't need to consent, Frances said. The recordings are legal. Please sit down. I'm not going to sit here and be ambushed. Naomi. My voice. Quiet. Sit down. Something in it worked. She sat. Her breathing had changed, faster, shallower, and the composure she'd walked in wearing was gone now, replaced by something rawer and less controlled. Ethan had his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands. Frances played the third recording. This one was harder to listen to, even for me, and I had listened to it many times. It was from September, 2 weeks before the cabin. Ethan alone with me in this room, in these chairs. Naomi hadn't come that day, which was unusual, and I'd thought at the time that her absence might mean something was shifting, that maybe Ethan was trying to find his way back to something. Instead, what I heard was Ethan delivering an ultimatum. His voice on the recording. I need you to understand something, Mom. The way things are structured right now, the estate, the property, all of it, it's not workable. It's not fair to us. We've been patient, but we need to know that when the time comes, things will be handled the right way. Well, my voice quieter. What does the right way mean? It means that what's ours should come to us, not to foundations, not to conservation projects, not to... A pause. Not to strangers. It's my money, Ethan. It's family money. It was always family money. Dad would have wanted... Don't. My voice on the recording had a sharpness I remembered feeling but hadn't realized had come through. Don't tell me what Gerald would have wanted. You didn't know him at the end. You were barely there. A long silence on the recording, then Ethan's voice, different now. Colder, stripped of the reasonable son performance. I'm trying to do this the easy way, Mom. I'd really prefer the easy way. I'd really prefer the easy way. The recording ended. The room was silent for what felt like a long time. Ethan hadn't moved. He was still forward in his seat, elbows on knees, but his hands had come down from his face, and he was staring at the carpet with an expression I couldn't fully read, shame and anger and something frightened underneath both. Naomi was looking at the wall. "The fourth recording," Francis said, "is from the cabin property 2 months ago, when Ethan discussed the sale value of the lakefront land with a developer contact via a phone call that he made while standing on my client's porch, believing she was inside and out of earshot." She set her phone down on the table without pressing play. "I'll let you know that exists. We don't need to play it today." Ethan looked up. "How long?" he said. His voice had the flattened quality of a person who has run out of performance and is down to the actual thing. "How long have you been recording?" I said. 7 months, documenting. About a year before that." He stared at me. "Mom." His voice broke slightly on the word. And I felt it. Of course I felt it. I am his mother, and I will probably feel it until I die. But I held where I was. "The cabin wasn't, I didn't think you would." "What?" I said. "Get out? Survive the night?" "What didn't you think, Ethan? Finish the sentence." He couldn't. "The county sheriff's office has already been in contact with the district attorney," Francis said. "The photographs from the cabin, combined with the recordings and the financial documentation, are sufficient to pursue charges. The preliminary categories include elder abuse, criminal confinement, criminal mischief, and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult." She said it without particular emphasis, the way you state facts that don't need embellishment. "I want to be clear that this morning is not a negotiation. Mrs. Carter is informing you, as a courtesy, before the formal proceedings begin." Naomi turned from the wall. Her face was, this is the only word for it, stripped. The careful architecture of her expressions had come down, and what was underneath was a woman who was genuinely afraid for the first time in this process. "You can't do this," she said. Her voice was lower than I had ever heard it. "You would actually put your own son—" "He put me in a cabin," I said. "He nailed the windows shut. It was 31 degrees. I looked at her directly, without hostility, without drama. Just the truth, flat and clear. "He made his choice. Now I'm making mine." What happened next took about 4 minutes, and I want to describe it carefully because it revealed something I had suspected for years and had never been able to confirm. Ethan broke first. He sat back on the couch, and he looked at Naomi with an expression that I recognized. It was the expression he'd had as a teenager when something had gone wrong, and he was trying to figure out whether it was his fault or someone else's. He had carried that expression into adulthood and learned to hide it better, but it was there. "You said they'd never use it," he said to her. Naomi's eyes cut to him. "You told me it was a bluff," he said. His voice had the particular quality of someone who has just understood something they had been avoiding understanding. "You told me she was too. You said she wouldn't actually." "Ethan, stop talking," Naomi said. "You planned the cabin," he said. "That was your plan. I went along with it because you said—" "Ethan," her voice had gone hard, "stop talking." He stopped, but the silence after his stopping said everything the words had started to say. I sat in my chair and I watched my son look at his wife, and I saw, maybe for the first time in the years since they'd married, what the actual geometry of that relationship was. Not a partnership, not two people deciding together. One person deciding and one person executing, and the one executing telling himself it was a collaboration so that the weight of it felt shared. Ethan had not been the architect of what had been done to me. He had been the instrument. That didn't absolve him. He had still gotten in the car. He had still walked me inside and closed the door and driven away. His complicity was complete and real, and I was not going to minimize it, but it reordered something in my understanding, not of what had been done, but of how it had been designed. Naomi had built this, layer by layer, year by year, the distance from me, the entitlement to the inheritance, the nursing facility plan, the cabin. She had built it, and she had handed it to my son, and he had carried it, and now they were sitting on my couch watching everything collapse, and the only move she had left was to tell him to stop talking, and the only move he had left was to decide whether to listen. He listened, for now. Frances gathered the documents back into her briefcase with the same unhurried precision she'd displayed opening them. When she was done, she stood. "The DA's office will be in touch with you separately," she said. "I would strongly recommend retaining legal counsel before that contact is made. That's not advice I'm giving you professionally. You are not my clients. It's just sensible." Naomi stood also. Her posture had a rigidity to it that I recognized as the last form of control available to her, the body keeping its shape when everything else had given way. "Vivian," she said. She had dropped the Vivian like a weapon. Not warm, not familiar, just my name, used to try to establish some lateral position. "You're making a decision right now that you cannot undo. I want you to think about that." "I've been thinking about it for 8 months," I said. "We're family." The word landed differently than she intended it to. I let it sit there for a moment. "No," I said. "We're related. There's a difference." She looked at me for a long moment. And then, and this was the thing I had not expected, the thing that stayed with me longest after they left, her expression changed, not to remorse, not to apology. It changed to something that looked almost like respect, the grudging, unwilling kind that comes when you have underestimated an opponent and you are forced to revise your assessment. She picked up her coat. "Come on, Ethan," she said. He stood. He was taller than me. He had been taller than me since he was 16, and standing there he looked for just a moment the way he'd looked at 19 at Gerald's funeral, lost, young, not sure where the ground was. He looked at me. "Mom," he said. "Ethan," I said, "don't. I just want to... I know what you want to say. I know you want to tell me you're sorry, and that this wasn't you, it was the situation, it was pressure, it was Naomi, it was whatever the explanation is that lets you walk out that door feeling like less of the person who did this." I kept my voice level. "I'm not going to take that from you. You're going to have to carry it." He stood there a moment longer. Then he followed his wife out the door. I sat in the quiet for a while after they left. Frances went to the kitchen to make a call. I heard Dolores come down the stairs. She'd listened to the whole thing from the landing, I learned later, pressed against the wall like a teenager at a party she wasn't supposed to be at. And she came in and sat on the couch where they had been and looked at me. "Well," she said. "Well," I said. "Are you okay?" I thought about it honestly. "I feel like I've been in a car accident and I haven't figured out what's hurt yet," I said. "But I'm still here. That's something." "That's a lot," Dolores said. She was right about that. Frances came back from the kitchen with her coat on and her briefcase in hand. She looked at me with the expression I'd come to understand meant she was about to say something she'd been deciding whether to say. "For what it's worth," she said, "in 31 years I have not seen cleaner documentation from a non-attorney." "I had a good teacher," I said. "You had good instincts," she said. "I just confirmed them." She paused at the doorway. "The DA will move quickly. The cabin evidence alone is significant. The recordings and financial documentation on top of it, they're going to have a very hard time." "I know." "This is going to get public at some point," she said carefully. "These things usually do. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about Ethan's face when he listened to his own voice. I thought about Naomi saying we're family in a tone that was a threat. "I spent 30 years making myself smaller so that nobody would be uncomfortable," I said. "I think I'm done worrying about what's public." Frances nodded once. Then she was gone. Dolores and I sat in the quiet living room for a while without talking. The flat gray light came through the windows. The neighbor's cat had appeared on the porch again and was pressing its face against the glass with the serene persistence that is the particular gift of cats. "What happens now?" Dolores said. "Now the legal process runs," I said. "Frances says it could take months. There'll be hearings, documentation requests, probably a period where things are very unpleasant before they get resolved." "And the will? The estate?" "Already restructured," I said. "Has been for 6 months. Nothing they can challenge. Frances made sure of that. Everything is exactly where I want it." "And the cabin?" I looked at Gerald's photograph. I thought about 31 years of October light on lake water. I thought about a man who had called a falling apart cabin beautiful because he understood that most good things are, when you first find them. I'm keeping the cabin, I said. Good, Dolores said. I'm going to fix the roof. Also good. And I'm going to go there in the spring by myself and sit on the porch and watch the water, and I am going to stay as long as I want. Dolores was quiet for a moment. He lost, didn't he? She said. It was barely a question. They both did, I said. They just don't fully understand it yet. Outside, the cat had given up on the window and was sitting on the porch step, cleaning its face with one paw, entirely unconcerned with anything that had happened in this house that morning. I watched it and felt something move through me. Not triumph exactly, nothing so clean as that, but something adjacent to peace. The particular peace that comes when you have stopped pretending and started reckoning, when the truth of a thing is finally out in the room and taking up the space it was always going to take. I had told the truth. I had shown them what I knew. I had not flinched. Whatever came next, I had done that. And it turned out, after 30 years of swallowing everything, of saying I'm fine, of making myself invisible so that other people could be comfortable, it turned out that not flinching felt exactly like what I'd always suspected it would feel like. It felt like being myself again. The legal process does not move the way drama moves. There's no single moment where a gavel comes down and everything resolves. It moves the way water moves through rock, slowly, persistently, in ways that look like nothing is happening until suddenly the shape of everything has changed. I learned that in the weeks after Ethan and Naomi walked out of my living room. Frances had warned me it would be unglamorous. She had used that exact word, unglamorous, and she was right. There were phone calls with the DA's office that lasted 40 minutes and covered procedural details I had to write down because the terminology was unfamiliar and I refused to nod along pretending I understood things I didn't. There were additional statements to Deputy Aldridge, who turned out to be more thorough than his young face suggested, and who called me twice with follow-up questions that told me he was building something careful and solid. There were document requests, copies of bank statements, the original loan letter, the voicemail from the Meridian Realty agent, and I provided everything Frances asked for, everything Aldridge asked for, everything the DA's office asked for, in organized folders with dates and context notes because I had been organizing this material for 8 months, and I was not going to let it be confusing to the people who needed to use it. It was work, exhausting, necessary, unglamorous work. And while that work was happening, on the other side of town, Ethan and Naomi's life was beginning to come apart in ways I had not specifically engineered, but which were the natural consequence of the truth being out in the world where it could no longer be managed. But the first thing that happened was that Ethan's firm found out. I did not tell them. I want to be clear about that because it matters to me. And because the cleaner version of this story would have me orchestrating every consequence with strategic precision, and the truth is messier than that. The truth is that Deputy Gaines, in the course of his investigation, contacted Ethan's employer as a standard procedural step, verifying employment, establishing timeline, something routine. The nature of the investigation was not concealed because it couldn't be, and the firm's HR department, upon learning that one of their senior analysts was under investigation for elder abuse and criminal confinement, did what firms do when they become aware of legal exposure adjacent to their employees. They put Ethan on administrative leave pending review. I found out from Frances, who found out from the DA's office. She called me on a Thursday morning 2 weeks after the living room meeting. Ethan's been placed on leave at Hartfield and Associates, she said. I sat with that for a moment. When? Tuesday, 2 days ago. Does that affect the legal process? Not directly, but it tells us something about the timeline. If his firm is already moving, it means the investigation is further along than Ethan knows. I put the phone down after that call and stood in my kitchen for a while without doing anything in particular. I thought about the Tuesday evenings when Ethan used to call me. I thought about the boy who had saved lawn mowing money. I thought about administrative leave, which sounds bureaucratic and clean, but which I knew, from having watched a colleague go through it 30 years ago, is its own specific form of humiliation. The badge that doesn't work, the emails you can't access, the colleagues who stop returning your calls because they don't know what to say, and proximity to trouble feels dangerous. I did not feel good about it. I want to say that clearly. I did not feel good about it. It would be a neater story if I did. If every consequence that fell on Ethan landed with the satisfying weight of justice cleanly delivered. But I'd loved that man since before he was a person, since he was a set of small movements against my ribs. And the fact that he had become someone capable of what he had done to me did not erase what he had been before that, or what I had hoped he might still become. What I felt was something more complicated than satisfaction, something more like grief with a floor under it. He had made his choices. The choices had costs. That was not my doing, but I felt it. Naomi's professional unraveling happened differently, faster and more publicly, which I suspected was connected to the particular nature of her work. She was a consultant, the kind whose value is built on reputation and relationships and the confidence of clients who need to believe their advisor's judgment is sound. She worked in a world where perception was almost indistinguishable from reality, where a single piece of damaging information placed in the right context at the right time could restructure everything. The recordings were the right context, and they reached the right people without anyone deliberately placing them, because that is what happens when documentation enters legal proceedings. It becomes part of a record that is not private, and records are read by people whose interests are served by what they contain. Within 3 weeks of the Monday meeting, 2 of Naomi's major clients had quietly ended their contracts. I learned this not from Francis, but from Dolores, who had a friend who worked at one of the firms involved, and who called Dolores with the information in the particular tone people use when they are delivering news they know is significant. Her client list is shrinking, Dolores told me. Word gets around in those circles. It gets around fast. How is she handling it? I asked, and then I was briefly surprised at myself for asking, because it was a question that contained more concern than I had expected to feel. Dolores paused. Apparently not well. I nodded and didn't say anything else about it. What was there to say? Naomi had built a life around the careful maintenance of appearances, and the recordings had done what recordings do. They had played her actual words in her actual voice, in rooms full of people who had previously only known the version of her that she had curated for their consumption. The gap between the 2 versions was not something charm could close. She had known the recordings existed. From the moment Francis played them in my living room, Naomi had understood exactly what she was facing. And in the weeks that followed, watching her world contract, I thought sometimes about that moment. The moment her composure had cracked along one edge, just slightly, and she had stood up and said, I want to stop this. She had known then. She had understood in that moment precisely what those recordings meant and what they were going to do. And still, sitting across from that knowledge, she had looked at me and said, We're family, like it was a password that should open a door she had long since decided to keep locked. The formal charges came on a Wednesday, 6 weeks after the cabin. Francis called me at 8 in the morning. I was drinking coffee and reading, the same thing I did most mornings, the ordinary texture of a life that had survived being interrupted. It's official, she said. Ethan has been charged with criminal confinement, criminal mischief in the 1st degree, and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Naomi has been charged as a co-conspirator on the financial exploitation count, and separately with criminal coercion based on the recorded September conversation. I set down my coffee cup. The criminal coercion charge, I said. That's based on... I'd really prefer the easy way, Francis said. Yes. Combined with the subsequent actions at the cabin, the DA's office considers that statement, in context, to constitute criminal coercion. The timeline matters. The statement was made, and then specific physical steps were taken that were consistent with following through on it. I sat with that. They'll be arraigned Thursday, Francis continued. Bail will likely be set. This is going to be in the local news. I know. Are you prepared for that? I've been preparing for that since November, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Vivian, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly. All right? Is there any part of you, any part at all, that wants to pull back, reduce the charges, accept some kind of private resolution, something that keeps this out of the courts and the papers? I knew why she was asking, not because she thought I should. Francis was not the kind of attorney who pushed clients toward settlements they didn't want. She was asking because she wanted to make sure I knew my own mind, that the answer I was giving her was the answer I actually held, and not a performance of strength I was putting on because backing down felt like weakness. I thought about it honestly. I gave myself 30 full seconds to think about it, which is longer than it sounds. No, I said. Okay. If I pull back now, it means what happened in that cabin was something I can be paid or pressured to absorb, I said. It means the next woman this happens to, the next woman who ends up in a dark room with nailed plywood over the windows because her child decided she was more valuable gone than present. It means what happened to her was also something that can be managed quietly. I paused. I'm not willing to be quietly managed. Not anymore. Another brief silence. Good, Frances said. And I could hear in that single word everything she didn't add. 31 years of watching people absorb what should not be absorbed, watching families close ranks around cruelty because exposure felt worse than harm. I could hear how much she meant it. Good, she said again. I'll call you after the arraignment. The news coverage was not what I had expected, and what I had expected was bad enough. A local news station ran the story Thursday evening. Courthouse steps, standard format, the kind of segment that usually runs 90 seconds and is forgotten by morning. But something in the details caught. Maybe it was the cabin. Maybe it was the recordings, which the DA's office had confirmed existed and which the reporter had described in enough specific detail to make their content clear without quoting them directly. Maybe it was simply the particular awfulness of the image. An elderly woman, alone in a cold, dark cabin, with birthday candles for light and her dead husband's walkie-talkie as her only hope of rescue. People reacted to that image. The story was picked up by a regional affiliate by Friday morning. By Friday evening, it had appeared on 2 national news websites. By Saturday, my phone, which I had given only to Frances, Dolores, Martin, and 2 cousins I trusted, had 14 missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize, and Dolores was sitting at my kitchen table fielding them because I had asked her to, and she had agreed with the focused energy of a woman who had been looking for something useful to do for 6 weeks. Another reporter, she said, putting the phone down after one call. The 3rd one from that national outlet. Tell them what you've been telling them, I said. Mrs. Carter appreciates the public's concern and has no comment at this time, Dolores recited, in the practiced tone of someone who had said it enough times that morning to have internalized it. Then, in her own voice, though honestly, Vivian, at some point, not yet, I said. Frances says not yet. Frances also said this was going to be local news for a day or 2. Frances is an attorney, not a prophet. Dolores looked at me. Are you scared? Of the attention? I thought about it. No. A little uncomfortable, but not scared. I picked up my coffee. I spent so long being afraid of what people would think if they knew, afraid they'd judge me for the money I'd given away, for not seeing it sooner, for being the kind of mother whose son... I stopped. Started differently. The attention means the truth is out. I'd rather have the truth out than stay comfortable and quiet and let what happened to me happen like it doesn't matter. Dolores was quiet for a moment. You know what's funny, she said. What? 3 years ago, when I suggested you come to book club, you almost said no because you thought it would be awkward. You didn't like meeting new people. I didn't like meeting new people, I confirmed. And now you're national news. I laughed. It came out genuine and surprised me, and Dolores laughed too. And for a moment my kitchen felt like what it had always been before any of this. Just a room where 2 people who had known each other for 32 years drank coffee and said things to each other that nobody else would understand. How's Martin? I said. He came by this morning while you were on the phone with Frances. Left a casserole on the porch. Of course he did. He said, and I'm quoting, "Tell her the noise will pass and the lake will still be there in spring." Dolores paused. I think he means the cabin. I know what he means, I said. The arraignment produced bail for both of them, which I had expected and which Frances had told me not to read as an indicator of anything. They posted it within hours, which meant they still had liquid assets and legal representation, which meant the consequences they were facing had not yet reached the level of total structural collapse. that was coming. It was coming, and anyone who understood the shape of what had been documented against them could see it coming. But it wasn't there yet. What arrived first, in the space between the arraignment and the beginning of formal proceedings, was a letter. It came through Francis, as any communication between the parties was now required to do. A handwritten letter, 2 pages, in Ethan's handwriting that I recognized the way you recognize anything you've known for 40 years. The particular slope of his lowercase letters, the way he pressed too hard with a pen so that the words were slightly embossed on the back of the page. Francis sent me a scanned copy and called to tell me it existed before I opened it. "You don't have to read it," she said. "I know. It could be a legal strategy, an attempt to establish a record of remorse before—" "Francis," I said, "I know. I'm going to read it anyway." I read it twice, slowly, at the kitchen table with the door closed and Dolores out at the grocery store because I wanted to be alone for it. The letter was not what I expected. I had expected something that was half apology and half argument. The kind of letter written by a person trying to do 2 things at once and succeeding at neither. What I got instead was something more unguarded and in some ways more painful than that. He wrote about Gerald. About a specific afternoon when he was 11 and Gerald had driven him to a baseball game 3 towns over. Just the 2 of them. A Tuesday. Some minor league game that meant nothing except that his father had taken a day off work specifically to take him. He hadn't thought about that day in years, he wrote, and then recently he had been thinking about it constantly, and he wasn't sure why, except that maybe it was because it was the last clear memory he had of understanding exactly what love looked like and feeling certain he was inside it. He wrote about the lawn mowing money and the bookshelf. He knew it was crooked, he wrote. He had been mortified by it for years. And then at some point in his 30s, he had stopped thinking about the crooked shelf with mortification and started thinking about it with something else, something he couldn't name properly in the letter but which came through anyway. He wrote, in the second page, that he was not going to excuse what he had done. He wrote, and this was the part that cost me the most to read, that he knew Naomi had shaped a great deal of what had happened, but that shaping was not the same as forcing, and that he had chosen at every step to let himself be shaped because it was easier than the alternative, and that the easiest version of a thing is not always the right one, and that he had learned that too late. He didn't ask me to drop the charges. He didn't ask for anything. The letter ended, simply, with, "I know I can't fix this. I'm sorry, anyway." I sat at the table for a long time after I finished reading. Then I folded the letter and put it in the drawer where I kept important things, and I went and made more coffee, and I stood at the window and looked at the November yard and thought about what love is when it has been broken and what, if anything, it is after. I didn't have an answer. I'm not sure there is one that fits neatly. What I had was the knowledge that a letter, however honest, was not accountability. A letter was words. Accountability was standing in the consequences of what you had done without flinching, the same way you had required someone else to stand in the consequences of what you had done to them. Ethan had a long way to go before he got to accountability. Whether he would get there was not something I could control or predict. What I could control was what I built in the meantime, what I protected, what I stood for, what I refused to let be diminished. The civil proceedings began in January. Francis had told me the civil action, the financial exploitation claim, the property damage, would run parallel to the criminal process and might actually resolve faster. She was right about the speed. By late January, we were in a conference room at her firm with opposing counsel, and the shape of what Ethan and Naomi faced in terms of financial liability had been laid out in the specific, unambiguous language of numbers. Their attorney, a man named Cresswell, who had the slightly rumpled look of someone who had taken a case he now regretted, pushed for mediation. He used the word family 17 times in the first 40 minutes. I counted. Not because I was looking for something to be angry about, but because the repetition was itself a strategy, a way of suggesting that the financial and legal facts of the situation should be subordinated to a category of feeling that Ethan and Naomi had spent years demonstrating they did not actually respect. "My client understands that there are legitimate grievances here," Cresswell said. "He's prepared to discuss a repayment structure for the outstanding loan amounts and to address the property damage from the cabin and he hopes that an agreement in that direction might allow the parties to begin rebuilding. The outstanding loan amount plus applicable interest and penalties, Francis said. The property damage at the cabin, assessed at current repair costs. Compensatory damages for the confinement. An assigned agreement stipulating that neither party will contest or challenge Mrs. Carter's estate planning in any current or future form. She paused. That's the floor, not the ceiling. Cresswell looked at Ethan. Ethan was sitting across the table from me for the first time since the living room. He looked different than he had that Monday morning. Thinner, tired in a way that wasn't just sleep deprivation, wearing a suit that fit him slightly wrong, like he'd lost weight since he bought it. Naomi was not there. Their attorneys had advised them to attend separately, which told me everything about how unified their position still was. He looked at me once, directly, at the beginning of the session. I looked back. Neither of us said anything, and then we both looked back at our respective attorneys and the meeting continued. There was a moment, about 90 minutes in, when Cresswell stepped out to make a call, and Francis went with him to clarify a document question, and Ethan and I were left alone at the conference table for the first time. The silence lasted about 20 seconds. Then Ethan said quietly, "Did you read it?" "Yes," I said. "Okay," he said. Another silence. "The shelf is still there," I said. I don't know exactly why I said it. It was just the thing that was true. He looked at me. Something moved across his face that I couldn't fully identify. Not hope, not quite, but something in that vicinity. "I know," he said. Francis came back in. The moment closed. We went back to the language of compensatory damages and stipulated agreements and the floor that was not the ceiling, and Ethan's attorney began the process of understanding that they had very little room to negotiate because the documentation left them almost nowhere to stand. By the end of February, an agreement had been reached on the civil matter. I'm not going to tell you the exact dollar amount because it's not the number that matters. What matters is that it was sufficient, and that every cent of it went directly into the foundation I was in the process of establishing, not into my personal accounts, not into anything with my name on it, except as the signature of the person who had made it possible. Into the foundation, into something that would outlast all of this. The criminal proceedings took longer. They always do. Ethan pled guilty to a reduced charge in March. Criminal confinement reduced through negotiation, the financial exploitation charge maintained. He received a suspended sentence, probation, mandatory counseling, and community service. It was not by the measure of what he had done, a devastating legal outcome. Francis told me to expect that. She told me the criminal justice system and my sense of justice were not the same instrument, and that expecting one to fully deliver the other was a reliable path to bitterness. She told me to focus on what the guilty plea meant. Not the sentence, but the admission. The formal, legal, on-the-record admission that what had happened in that cabin had happened, that it had been wrong, that there was no version of events in which it was anything else. Naomi's case took another 2 months. She fought harder than Ethan had. She had more to prove, or more to lose, or simply more of the kind of determination that had always driven her. But the recordings were what they were, and the DA's office had built carefully, and in May she pled guilty to criminal coercion and received probation and a fine that her depleted client list made genuinely painful to pay. The last client had ended their contract in April. The morning I found out about Naomi's plea, I was at the cabin. I had gone out in late April, the first time since October, and I had done exactly what I told Dolores I would do. I had sat on the porch and watched the lake and stayed as long as I wanted. I had brought food and good coffee and Gerald's flannel blanket that smelled like cedar, and I had sat in the spring sun, and I had let the water just be water. I'd had Martin come out the week before and fix the roof. He'd brought a neighbor's son to help, and they'd spent a Saturday up there. And when I arrived, the cabin was sound and dry and smelled like sawdust and possibility in roughly equal measure. Francis texted me the news about Naomi's plea while I was sitting on the porch with the third cup of coffee. I read it. I set the phone face down on the porch railing. I looked at the lake. The water was that specific color it gets in early May, a deep gray blue that shifts toward green in the afternoon light. The color Gerald had always said couldn't be reproduced in paint, that you had to be there in person to actually see it. He was right about that. He was right about a lot of things that I hadn't fully appreciated until after he was gone. I sat there for a long time. I thought about the $61,000, not with grief now, but with the clear-eyed reckoning of a person who has finally stopped performing emotions they don't quite feel. It was money. It was gone. What replaced it? The foundation, the documented truth, the legal record, the porch in the May morning, was not money, but it was not nothing either. I thought about Ethan's letter in the drawer at home. I thought about the crooked bookshelf. I thought about a 19-year-old boy at his father's funeral, lost, not sure where the ground was. I thought about the woman who had nailed plywood over her windows, and I thought, that was not the end. You thought it was the end, and it wasn't. I picked up the phone and I called Dolores. It's over, I said. I know, she said. Frances called me. Of course she did. Where are you? The cabin. Of course you are. A pause, warm and long and full of 32 years. How does it look? I looked at the lake. The light was moving on the water the way it always did in May, shifting and unreproducible, something you had to be there in person to actually see. It looks like mine, I said. Summer came to the cabin the way it always had, without asking permission, without ceremony, in the particular slow accumulation of warmth and light that Gerald used to say was the lake's way of reminding you it had been there long before you arrived and would be there long after. I spent 3 weeks there in June, not consecutive days from some rigid plan, but 3 weeks built from mornings that stretched into afternoons that stretched into evenings, where I sat on the porch and watched the light change on the water and did not explain myself to anyone. I read 4 books. I fixed the screen door that had been sticking since 2019. I learned at 66 years old that I could sit in complete silence for 2 hours without becoming anxious about what I was supposed to be doing instead, which sounds like a small thing and is actually enormous. If you have spent most of your adult life organizing yourself around other people's needs and calling it love. Martin called once to check on me. Dolores called every other day, which was her version of restraint, and I appreciated it. Frances sent a brief email in the second week updating me on some final administrative details from the proceedings, loose ends, paperwork, the bureaucratic tale of a legal process winding down. I read the email sitting at the kitchen table with the window open and the sound of the lake coming through, and then I closed the laptop and went back to the porch. The foundation paperwork had been finalized in late May. Frances's colleague, a sharp, meticulous estate attorney named Caldwell, who had the organized intensity of a man who genuinely loved what he did, had walked me through the final documents with the care of someone who understood that what he was helping to build mattered beyond the legal mechanics of building it. The Carter Family Foundation for Independent Women. I had named it that after 3 weeks of considering other options and returning always to the simplest version of what it was, something named for the family I actually was. Not the one that had failed me, but the one Gerald and I had tried to build, the values we had tried to hold, the belief that a person's dignity is not contingent on who else chooses to recognize it. The foundation would support single mothers in financial crisis, emergency housing assistance, legal aid for custody and financial disputes, vocational training for women re-entering the workforce after years out of it. Women who had been managed, as Frances had once put it. Women who had been isolated from their own perspective. Women who needed someone to put something real in their hands and say, you have options. I thought about my mother when I signed the final documents. She had raised 3 children on a schoolteacher's salary after my father left, in a house with a leaking roof she couldn't afford to fix for 3 years. She had never once described herself as a woman in crisis. She had described herself as a person who had work to do, which is a different way of understanding the same circumstances. I wish she were alive to see this. I wished I could hand her the folder with the foundation documents and watch her read it. I signed my name and thought of her and felt, in the complicated, layered way that grief and pride can occupy the same moment, that she would have understood exactly what this was. Ethan came in July. I had not known he was going to come. He did not call ahead, which I recognized as either a failure of nerve or a deliberate avoidance of giving me the opportunity to say no, and honestly, it was probably both, which is the kind of impure, mixed motive reality that actual human beings operate in, as opposed to the clean villains and heroes that stories sometimes try to make us. I was on the porch when I heard gravel. Then I heard a car door, and then footsteps, and then Ethan came around the corner of the cabin and stopped when he saw me. He looked. The word that came was diminished, and I turned it over for a moment to make sure I was being accurate and not cruel. He had lost more weight since the civil proceedings. His hair had more gray in it than I remembered, and he was wearing clothes that had none of the careful put-together quality that Naomi had always maintained in his appearance. Jeans, a plain shirt, the kind of unremarkable combination that a man wears when he is no longer dressing for an audience. We looked at each other across the porch. "I should have called," he said. "Yes," I said. "You should have." He stood there a moment. "Can I sit down?" I said. I did not say it warmly. I said it the way you say something that is not a welcome but is not a refusal either, a middle place, which was the most honest place I had available. He sat in Gerald's chair. I had not offered him Gerald's chair specifically, and he didn't know it was Gerald's chair. There were 2 chairs on the porch, and he sat in the one farther from me, and it happened to be the one Gerald had sat in every summer for 30 years. I noticed it and said nothing about it. For a while, neither of us spoke. The lake was flat and bright in the July sun. A bird was doing something complicated in the pine trees at the water's edge. Everything was ordinary and specific and real. "The divorce is finalized," Ethan said. I had known it was coming. Francis had mentioned it as a procedural matter, something that had been filed in April. "I know," I said. "I don't know if that—" He stopped. Started differently. "I'm not telling you because I think it changes anything. I just thought you should know." "Okay." Another silence. "I'm staying in a rental," he said, "on the east side. It's—" He looked at the lake. "It's fine. It's temporary." "Are you working?" "Consulting, freelance, small stuff." He said it without self-pity, which I registered as a change from the version of him I had known in the last years of the marriage, who had worn his professional success like a shield. Hartfield and Associates didn't— There wasn't a path back there. I understood that. "Yes," I said. He turned from the lake and looked at me directly, which he had not done yet since sitting down. In his face, I saw the specific exhaustion of a person who has been through something they cannot fully explain to themselves yet. Not just the legal proceedings, not just the divorce, but the confrontation with who they had been and what they had allowed and what it had cost. It was an exhaustion that had some reckoning in it, and reckoning is not nothing. "Mom," he said, I'm not here to ask you for anything. I want you to know that first. I'm not here to ask you to drop anything or change anything or, he paused. "I'm not here with an agenda." "What are you here for?" He looked at the lake again. "I don't fully know," he said. That's the honest answer. I know it's not a satisfying one. "It's more honest than most things you've said to me in the last 5 years," I said. "So that's something." He absorbed that without deflecting, which also registered as a change. "The letter," he said. Was it? "It was honest," I said. "It was the most honest thing you'd said to me in a long time. I could tell you wrote it for yourself as much as for me, and that's all right. People usually do." He nodded. "I kept it," I said. He looked at me. Something moved in his face. Not quite relief, but something in its neighborhood. "You should know," I said, "that keeping a letter is not the same thing as forgiveness. And forgiveness, if it ever comes, is not the same thing as returning to what we were. I want to be clear about that because I think clarity is the only thing that has ever actually served either of us." "I know," he said. "I'm not sure you do, fully. Not yet. I think you're at the beginning of understanding it, which is different from knowing it." I looked at him steadily. "You were managed by Naomi for years. I understand that. I watched it happen, and I grieved it as it happened because I knew somewhere what I was watching. But Ethan, being managed is not the same as having no agency. You made choices. You walked me into that cabin. You drove away." My voice stayed level. "I need you to sit with that, not the version where Naomi is responsible for what happened and you're the secondary story. The version where you are fully, completely responsible for what your hands and your feet did. He was quiet for a long time. I know, he said, and this time it sounded different. Not the quick acknowledgement of a person trying to move past an uncomfortable point, but something slower and more weighted, the sound of a person actually sitting inside a truth rather than standing at its edge. Good, I said. We sat for a while longer without talking. The bird in the pine trees had sorted out whatever it was doing. The lake moved slightly in a small wind that came and went. The foundation, he said finally. I read about it, in the news coverage. What did you think? He took a moment. I thought... He stopped. I thought it looked like you, like who you actually are. He paused again. I think I forgot who you actually are. For a long time. I substituted the version Naomi gave me, and I stopped... He pressed his lips together. I stopped looking for the original. That sentence cost him something. I could hear the cost of it. Yes, I said. You did. I'm sorry for that specifically, he said. Not just for the cabin, for the years of the progressive... He didn't seem to have the word. For making you smaller. I sat with that for a moment. That one lands differently, I said honestly. The cabin was terrible, but watching my son look through me for 5 years, that was its own kind of terrible. He nodded. He didn't try to explain it away. We sat there on the porch, the two of us, in the uncomfortable and necessary space of a conversation that was not a reconciliation and not a goodbye. Something in between, something without a clean name. A reckoning. A beginning, maybe, of something that might eventually become a different kind of relationship than the one we'd lost. Or might not. I was not going to lie to myself about the probability, but it was honest. For the first time in years, sitting on this porch with my son, what was between us was honest. You should go, I said, after a while. Not because you're not welcome to have stayed longer, but because I think we've said what there is to say today, and staying past that never helps. He stood. He looked at me and then at the lake, and then at the cabin itself. The repaired roof, the straight porch boards Martin had fixed, the screen door that no longer stuck. It looks good, he said. The cabin. It always did, I said. I just let myself be talked out of seeing it clearly for a while. He understood what I was also saying. I watched him understand it. I'm going to do the work, he said. The counseling. Whatever it takes to become someone who wouldn't... He stopped. I just want you to know, I'm not going to just exist in what I did. I'm going to try to be different. Good, I said. Do it for yourself. Not to earn something back from me. Do it because it's who you actually want to be. I paused. That boy who spent his lawn mowing money on a bookshelf, I think he's still in there somewhere. But I can't find him for you. That's yours. He stood at the edge of the porch for a moment. The shelf is still crooked, he said. Structurally sound, I said. Just crooked. For just a second, for just 1 second, he smiled. Not the performed smile, not the careful social expression. The real one, the one I recognized from 20 years ago, that reached his eyes and made him look like Gerald. Then he walked back around the cabin, and I heard the gravel, and the car door, and the engine, and then I heard the road. I sat in the quiet for a long time after he left. I didn't cry. I thought I might, and I sat there prepared for it, but it didn't come. What came instead was something quieter, an odd, settling peace, the kind that doesn't announce itself but simply arrives, like the moment in a long illness when you realize the fever is broken and you're still here. He was not forgiven. Not yet. Maybe eventually. Not for his sake, but for mine. Because I had learned over 66 years that carrying unforgiveness is its own kind of imprisonment, and I had been imprisoned enough. But he was seen, clearly, for what he had done and for what he might still become. And so was I. The foundation held its first event in September. A small thing, a reception at the community center, about 40 people, mostly the women who were the first recipients of the assistance fund, and the small group of donors Francis had helped me identify who believed in what we were building. Dolores came. Martin came, wearing a jacket that he had clearly pressed specifically for the occasion and which touched me more than I could adequately express. Frances was there with her reading glasses on the chain, standing near the back with the expression of someone who is pleased with how something has turned out, but doesn't want to make a fuss about it. I gave a short speech. I had written it and rewritten it a dozen times, trying to find the right balance between truth and usefulness, between what had happened to me and what I wanted to put into the world because of it. I did not want to stand at that podium and perform my own suffering for an audience. I wanted to say something that would be worth saying to a room full of people who had, in various ways, been where I had been. I said this: I spent a very long time believing that the most loving thing I could do was make myself easy. Easy to be around, easy to dismiss, easy to manage. I confused self-erasure with generosity, and it nearly cost me everything: my home, my resources, my physical safety, and the thing that is harder to name than any of those, which is the sense that my life and my choices belong to me. I paused. The room was quiet in the particular way rooms get when something true is being said and people know it. What I want every woman who is supported by this foundation to know is something it took me 66 years and one very dark night in a cabin to understand. Your dignity is not negotiable. Not with family, not with anyone. The people who love you correctly will not ask you to choose between love and self-respect, because real love does not require you to disappear. I stopped there, because that was the true end of it, and I have learned, late, but I have learned, that the truest things are usually shorter than you think they need to be. The applause was not thunderous. It was warm and genuine, and it came from people who had been in rooms of their own, dark in their own ways, and had found their way out or were still finding it. That was enough. That was more than enough. Dolores found me afterward, near the food table, and squeezed my arm without saying anything, which is the highest form of Dolores' compliment, and I accepted it accordingly. I want to tell you something before this story closes, because I think it is the most important thing, and I have been working toward it for everything that came before. There will be people listening to this who recognize something in it, not the specific events, the cabin, the recordings, the legal proceedings, but the feeling underneath all of it, the feeling of being managed by someone you loved, the feeling of swallowing something that should not be swallowed because the alternative feels too costly, the feeling of watching yourself become smaller and explaining it to yourself as kindness. I recognize you. I was you for 30 years, and I want to tell you what I know now from the other side of it. The moment you say I'm fine when you are not fine, the moment you absorb what should not be absorbed to protect someone else's comfort, you are not being loving. You are teaching that person that you have no limits. You are teaching them that there is no floor, and people who believe there is no floor will keep going down until they hit it, and by the time they hit it, the damage is done. Setting a limit is not cruelty. Protecting yourself is not selfishness. Saying this is mine and I will not give it to you is not a failure of love. It is the only way love can survive, with honesty, with boundaries, with the understanding that your well-being is not less important than someone else's, simply because they want more from you than you can healthily give. I think about the woman who sat on the floor of that dark cabin and cried until she ran out of tears. I think about her with more tenderness than I have for almost any version of myself I have known. She was frightened, and she was cold, and she had just understood something that broke her heart, and she got up off that floor. She made an inventory. She found a walkie-talkie on a high shelf, and she pressed the power button because there was one bar left, and maybe it would work, and maybe it wouldn't, but she was going to try. That is not a small thing. Getting up off the floor is not a small thing. Whatever floor you are on right now, whatever dark room has been locked around you, whether it was built by a family member or a partner or someone else you trusted with more than they deserve to be trusted with, I want you to know that there is something on the high shelf. There is always something on the high shelf. You have to get up to find it. Dignity is not given to you. It is not granted by the people who love you or withheld by the people who don't. It lives in you, permanently, and the only thing that can actually diminish it is your own decision to stop claiming it. The people who hurt me did not take my dignity. They tried to, and for a while I helped them try, but the thing itself, the core of it, was mine the entire time. I just had to stop apologizing for taking up the space it required. I am 66 years old. I have a repaired roof and a crooked bookshelf and a foundation that will outlast me and a porch on a lake where the light does something in May that cannot be reproduced in paint. I have a friend who puts too much sugar in coffee and a neighbor who leaves casseroles without being asked, and an attorney who says good in a way that means everything she doesn't add. I have my life. Fully, finally, irreversibly mine. And I want to tell you, whoever you are, wherever you are watching this from, whatever city you are in tonight, that this is available to you, not the specific circumstances, not the legal proceedings or the foundation or the cabin, but the claiming, the decision to stop making yourself easy and start making yourself honest, the understanding that the people worth keeping in your life will stay when you tell the truth, and the ones who leave when you stop disappearing were never staying for you in the first place. They were staying for the version of you that required nothing. You are worth more than that version. You have always been worth more than that version. It is October again now. 1 full year since the door clicked shut. I came to the cabin this weekend alone, the way I do now, the way I plan to keep doing until I can't anymore. The leaves are the color they get in mid-October. That particular combination of gold and rust and the dark green of the pines that Gerald always said looked like something that had been painted by someone showing off, except it was just the world doing what the world does, indifferent to whether anyone was there to see it. I sat on the porch this morning with the coffee I make exactly how I like it, no concessions, nobody else's preference, and I watched the light come across the water. I thought about Gerald, the way I always think about Gerald here, but differently than I used to. I used to think about him with the quality of loss, his absence as the central thing, the shape of where he should have been. I still miss him. I will miss him until I don't exist anymore to miss anyone, but I think about him differently now, with more of his own presence in it, the actual man rather than the gap, the way he held a door, the way he said most good things are when you first find them, the way he bought a falling-apart cabin with everything we had and was right about what it could become. I think he would have been angry about the cabin, specifically, properly, protectively angry in the way that decent men get angry when someone they love has been harmed. I think he would have sat with that anger for a while, and then he would have set it down, because Gerald understood that you can hold on to a wrong until it takes up all the room and there's nothing left for anything else. I think he would have been proud of the foundation. I think he would have looked at the repaired roof and the straight porch boards and said something like, "See, I told you it was worth keeping." He would have been right. I finished my coffee. I sat for another hour in the quiet that is not empty, but full of water sounds and wind, and the specific breathing quality of a place that has absorbed 30 years of a life and holds it gently, the way good places do. Then I went inside and made another cup exactly the way I like it, and I got on with my day. This is what freedom looks like, not the dramatic version, not the triumphant moment with the music swelling. Just this. A woman on a porch, on an ordinary October morning, drinking coffee the way she likes it, in a home that is hers, accountable to no one's comfort but her own. After a lifetime of shrinking, it is a very large feeling. It turns out that freedom was always this simple and always this hard, and the only thing standing between me and it was the belief, which I held for decades, which I am done holding, that my own life was something I had to earn permission to live. I don't need permission anymore. Neither do you.